here I am, and the purpose of this lecture is to give you an introduction to R. You know, at this point, you're probably in a variety of stages of your education. Some of you used R quite a bit, maybe you used it a little bit, but some of you may have not used it at all. And this is really just a crash course. What's the bare minimum I need to know to actually start doing something productive, and trying to cram it all into one lecture. So this may be information overload for some, and it may be a little bit, you know, old hat for others. But somewhere, hopefully, you'll find some interesting things in here. So, have you all installed R? Yeah, everybody's got it. Were there any problems? Did you try getting any? Well, let's go over a few things here. I think this was in the previous one. Under R preferences on Mac, it's like this. It's a little different on Windows. There's this read history file at startup. You most likely don't want that, because what that does is whatever you've typed the previous time, and you're sitting there working, loading files, and doing this and doing that, when you go to start it up, when you go to close, it's going to save everything you typed. And then when you start the program again, it's going to reload everything you typed, and maybe you did something that took half an hour, and then you're like, why isn't R starting? Because it's rerunning every single command you did. You can get into weird states where you don't know exactly what's going on. So I don't know why they allowed that, but it's almost always beneficial to turn it off unless you decide. It's your choice, however. So I basically, and I also have save workspace no. So I don't save it and I don't read it. It's my configuration, so I don't have that wasted space with that file left behind. What else was there? Startup editor, choice of editor. So the other thing is, there's a couple other things. So this is the command line prompt. There's also something called R Commander and R Studio, and those are both more point-and-click GUI interfaces into R. If you really want to get something that does that, those are worth checking out. I use the command line just, I think, especially for this demo, so you can understand what's going on underneath. There's no kind of point-and-click going on here. So you can actually see what the point-and-click things are execute. They would execute commands that would come to this prompt. Now, it opens up, I don't know where actually I can find out. I can get my working directory by calling that function, so I'm in my user space. So like today, I think I'm going to work in projects, and we're going to go to Quanta directory, and we're going to go into so what I've just done is I've executed a command, and you can see the open and close parentheses. That says here's a function I'm executing. Like the first one, I said get my working directory, and it gave me where this R prompt was running at. So if I ask for any files or anything, it's going to default to, you know, my home directory. And now with the set work directory, I've changed it to projects Quanta, Lourdes, Estrada, cancer biology 347. So I'm sitting there, and if I ask for a file, it's going to come out of that directory now in my home directory. So I've changed the state of it. And the Windows one's a little different, but the Mac one shows you where you're at up here. Like here's your home, here's the directory that I'm running from. So there's actually probably some things up here. One other thing that was covered before this document began was they have this thing about packages. And there's a website out there, CRAN, and this allows you to install packages that allow more different types of analysis. And one of the big ones I think that you'll encounter in this class is Bioconductor, which allows for a lot of protein analysis. They actually split off from the R working group, and they have their own website, their own installation routines, because it is such a big, huge package. They just decided it was better to manage it externally because it got so large. And it's really a wonderful resource because you can go out through Bioconductor and you can load public repositories of protein data in cancer or whatever your research area. They have a whole bunch of them published, and there's been papers coming out recently where people have done nothing but pull data from Bioconductor that somebody else did and analyze it and find more information. So there's There's volumes and volumes of information. So if you go into the package installer, you have to get a list, and it may ask you for a mirror, and you have to pick it. But this goes out and hits a web server and pulls all these packages that are available. And a nice one to have, I think, and you probably need it later in this class, is Frac ProLift. And so I can click on this, and you want to click Install Dependencies, because you're going to need everything it depends on as well. I don't know why that's not the default, but you install it, and it gets installed over here. And what it actually did was it went and read that package and it installed it into your environment. Now, that's installed for R to use. That doesn't mean it's actually running right now. So if I actually want to get into that library that I just installed, now it loaded it, and it had some required packages that it loaded. Stats 4, EMG. So that loaded that library that I just installed. So now I can use all the functions that are available in that library. So that gives you a huge number of things that you can do, of all kinds of fitting algorithms and statistics. I actually find most of these using Google, because just looking at the names of these, you probably don't necessarily know what they're doing. So trying to figure out what you need is basically, it's more a challenge for Google, and then coming and finding it here to install it. So that gets you the basics. So now you have a prompt, you have a working directory, where the prompt is working, and you have libraries that you can load. So this gets into the workflow here now. So if you're going to be working in R, repeatability is one of the most critical things in research. I mean, can another researcher reproduce what you did? And as we have more and more computational aspects to research, it gets increasingly difficult for other people to duplicate someone's work. So the burden of reproducibility. So if you make it easy for other people to reproduce your work, you'll probably get more references. So, and Nature has actually, with the recent Duke scandal, has gone to, you better send us a script that reproduces your figures even. So with that in mind, R, as a language, and why you would be interested in it, there's two things that it has as strengths that it brings to the table. It does statistics, and it's primarily for statistics, but it also, you can do publication quality graphics that are ready to be sent to Nature using R. Now that requires a lot of effort, but anything you're going to do to make really good graphics is probably going to require a lot of effort. I mean, if you send a print off from Excel to Nature and somebody sees that, I don't know, you probably get dinged some points right there because it's just the defaults in Excel. But if your paper sells on its own, that's good. But if you've taken or read any of Tufte's books, a good presentation goes a long way towards conveying the content of what your research is. So you should aim for being able to run whatever R code you write from scratch and have it produce a figure for your paper. You could have figure 1a.r, figure 1b.r, and have it all in a directory and have some of your data all in this directory. And you should be able to take that and run it and produce the figure that you're working with. Or, before you have it ready for a paper, there's always this organizational part, but having that actually, for the fractional proliferation paper we published, Nature required it. We provided them the R script and the data, and they could just reproduce an entire set of figures from the paper. They were cleaned up with Illustrator a little bit, but the basic gist of it was all there. So, repeatability is the key. So, I usually use a text editor separate from R, and I'm writing a script. And at any point in time, I could start at the top of that script and run straight down and do what's in that script. And that's why it was important to get rid of your R history too. I want to be able to close R, reopen R, have a clean environment, run that script, and get exactly what's in that script. I want to make sure that I can repeat what I've done. So I typically copy back and forth from my screen editor and drop it into R. If you use RStudio, you can edit and run it in R at the same time, all using that same GUI. So that's That's a work preference that some people do. So, you can just rerun the script directly from your editor with RStudio. So one of the things that's always very confusing is like, over here, I just loaded this package, frac proliv. Well, what's in it? What can I do with it? There's this mysterious thing I've loaded that I read on Google is something I should have, but I have no idea what I can do. Well, they have this question mark, and so I can say, what is frac proliv? It'll pop up a help page and it'll give me documentation. And this walks through telling you, what this package does, why it does it. And it has example commands that you can type. And to submit a package to R, they have a very, very stringent requirement. Every single line in here actually gets executed on a remote server, and they check the output to make sure that it doesn't give an error. So every one of these lines will execute. It may not match the text, so that's not guaranteed, but it's guaranteed to at least run. So you end up with tons of examples and hot links in here to find, more, that may be the function that I really need to use. Or you can click over here and say, there's usually there's an index for a package where you can look at all the functions it has. So I think if you go to, so you can even get into other packages if you keep clicking around. So I went into the maximum likelihood package for analyzing this microscopy data. It falls back on this it uses another package to do it. But poking around, I can find functions I need. So there's a lot of help available. And if you really don't know what you're searching for, you could say, you can do a double question mark, and this types a general search term, and it searches all the documentation, anywhere the word normal occurs. Oh, so there's a lot of places I have normality. And in statistics, that's not surprising. So what's surprising is it's mentioned in that few. It's actually primarily in, the base package has a bit of about normality. There's normalization. And so there's a wide variety of functions that you can do. So you can find something on just any broad search term that you were looking for. So there's a couple of ways that you can get some help about the function that you're using. And R has so many functions that I doubt anyone will ever learn them all. I mean, it's just an impossible task. I use this question mark all the time while working with R, just to even look at what's the function syntax of what I'm calling for functions that I know. So this is something that you'll do repeatedly in R just to keep some document. And the other good thing about R is, I think these are a couple of reasons why R took off as such an open source project. They check everything you sent them to make sure it runs, and the examples all run. They also require an example for every function. So before it will get published as a package, there's minimum requirements that make it easier on everyone downstream. So that was a very, very smart move on their part. So, variables. So if you've not had computer science or done any programming before, there's this idea of a variable. It's not a variable in the mathematical sense, like a calculus sense. A variable in computer science sense is like a box that you put a label on and you store something in it. So if I say x is 2, R created a box labeled x that contains the number 2. So now anytime I ask for x, I get the number 2. Right? It's a very simple thing. I can also say y is a variable that gets the gets the value of x. So y is also the number 2. Now, this is a core feature in many languages, and if I'm working in a computer language, this is one of the first things that I want to know. Does it copy by reference or does it copy by value? So now the question is, does y actually reference this? Is both x and y the same box, or did it copy the contents of x and create a new box? So you can test that is setting x to 3. X is 3, y is still 2. So it created a copy. So every time you create a variable, it creates a copy. Now that's nice, because now if I change the original, I don't have this weird side effect. The downside is I just now doubled the amount of memory I'm using, and I may not have needed to have 2 copies of it. So if you have some huge object and it takes up a tremendous amount of memory, you don't necessarily want to be creating copies and renaming it. That can be very expensive. You can also assign it simple arithmetic, like, so you can assign copies of itself. So y is now 3 as well. I can run that again. I can get y as 4. So you can do all your basic mathematical operators like a calculator. And in fact, I don't even use the default calculator on the Mac anymore. You just pull up R and do calculations. So it's now just a calculator as well. So it serves as it has a third purpose that it wasn't intended for, that it does quite well. Balance my checkbook, these sorts of things. So that's a good thing to know about. Now, one thing, I'm using this as the assignment operator to create that variable y, and it can refer to itself. So it takes whatever's on the right and evaluates that expression before assigning it back into the box. Some computer languages this would blow up in, but not in R. So this is a safe operation to use the variable on both sides. As an aside, that operator is also the equal sign. So I could say y equals 10, and y would be 10. That works exactly like this. However, I would recommend not doing this, because this has another meaning in another context. And in that other context, that's when you're passing named parameters into a function. So you can actually end up with different behaviors. So it's good to keep the meaning clear and not having something with 2 or 3 meanings. So I almost always use this for assignment. But be aware you can do it with equals, because you may see code that does that. And it's not necessarily bad, but it can lead to confusion. And I will get into that. It's a little esoteric. So now that I have this idea of a box and I can store something in it, these numbers were a type to the computer. And type theory is really becoming more and more powerful in the mathematical world because of computers have really pushed forward what we can do with type theory. And in this, if I said class, which actually this is object-oriented, the class is numeric. So the type of that object is numeric. So it's saying, oh, this was a number. And you can actually, I think, also have integers which don't have any floating points, but that's actually a 10.0000. It has all the decimals. It's a floating point numeric. It also supports complex numbers. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah. So if you had to do some complex arithmetic, yeah, it's class complex. So that's an extension of the numeric. So you could do all sorts of numeric things with values of I then. You also have Booleans. You can have a string as a class character. So if I say Z is Java, the class of Z is character. So it says this is a character, and really what Z is this string. So, and that's you can use either single or double quotes as well. I could have done oops. It works the same way. So you can use single or double quotes. It doesn't matter. They're the same in R. There's no special meaning there between the two. They have reserved words true or false for Boolean. So I can say class true if I'm trying to do a logical. It's a logical. So these are your Booleans. And there is shorthand. Oops. You can do T or A, or T or F, I mean. And once again, I recommend against that, because what if you declared a variable named F and you forgot about it? And now you're asking for the logical value of F, and R will probably give you something. So it's better to spell it out and keep it clear in the context of what you're doing. So, and that is a voice of experience. I named a variable F, and things got really weird. So, on the other side, don't name a variable F. Just don't do that. Just avoid the letter F and T. Now, you can also ask if a variable is see, here's the thing about the variables. I think it was T that actually got me, because I was doing it for time. So you can say also is logical, and it'll give you a logical value of asking about the class of something. So if you really wanted to test what a variable was in some piece of your code. So there's some special values that are worth mentioning, and they fit in multiple classes. There's NA, which is not available or missing data. So actually, that could be very curious. What is NA? It's illogical. But I could say, you know, I'm going to do something a little funky here that's we're not covering yet. Let's see. We'll cover this in a bit. So A is a vector, which means they're all the same class. So although it thinks that NA is logical, it actually fit in a vector of numbers, numericals. So it's treating it as a numerical here. So NA just simply means not available, missing data, and you can use it just about anywhere. So if you have missing data, and there's actually Vanderbilt's biostatistics department specializes in cases where you have missing data throughout your data set and how to correct for that. So if you ever have missing data in places and you're trying to fill something in, you're actually in one of the top places in the world to figure out how to deal with that. Null is an undefined value. It's not that it's not available, it's something undefined. NaN is not a number. You get that by dividing by 0. So if I said, what is 1 divided by 0? Well, I got infinity there. Sometimes you get not a number, but infinity is INF, and you can use is finite or is infinite to test a value to see if it is. That can occur if you're taking logarithms of numbers, and some of them are negative. You'll get negative infinities. And pi is also a constant built into R. So you have pi available as a constant. You can also cast using as dot and then the name of something. So if I did this, I'm going to take the character value, the ASCII character value 42, and I'm going to cast it as a double. So if we pick this apart, the first thing that was called was the function as double, or as character. So as character returned the string 42. So it's a number I put into the function. It returned a string 42, and then it called as double with 42, returning me the number type. So I can multiply 42 and 3, but if I do 42 times 3, I gets mad at you. You can't multiply a string. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't know what to do. You handed me text and you're asking me to do multiplication on it, so it blows up on you. So that's where class can come into play with these, what's being stored in a box. Now, this is where it starts taking off. So now you've got all these little bitty building blocks, these little Legos to play, that you've seen. But now you want to do something a little more complex. So a vector is actually probably one of the most commonly used components in R. And this is known as a data structure. So now I've shown little individual pieces of data. But now I want to put together data in some way and manage it. So It's an ordered sequence of any class, and all values must be of the same class. So you could mix strings and numerics in a vector together. So there's this function C, yet another thing to avoid naming a function. There's C and there's also T. So C, T, and F as single letters are kind of out. So, oops. So what this says here is I'm going to assign to the box X the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So now my box is actually 3 boxes inside the box, the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3. And they're in order. They have an order. They have a position. So R does allow things like this. I can assign Y to the value 0.7, and I can multiply X times Y, and it multiplies it element-wise. And actually what R does is it expands whatever it takes the longest vector and it just repeats the values of the smaller vectors until they're the same length. So you can do some really crazy things with it. I would avoid that if possible, but every now and then when I run into it, I've done something wrong and it's causing an error. And it usually will throw an error if it has to extend them by some odd interval. However, every now and then you can get bit by that. Just something to be aware of. So yeah, X plus Y, we can do all kinds of numeric as an alternative operation. Yeah, this is what I was saying. So now X and Y, here's X and here's Y. If I say X times Y, it actually did the computation and gave me a warning. So if I'm running some huge long script and I'm ignoring the warnings that go by, you may get behavior that you're not expecting. Because it took Y, it said Y was 0, 1, oh, I need another value. Let's start at the beginning, 0. And it multiplied them. So when it's just a single value, it just keeps repeating it across and it doesn't give you a warning. There's also a colon operator, so you can expand a list of numbers into a vector. So you can say, I want a vector that's 1 to 10. I got the numbers 1 to 10. You can do any sequence you want like that. So it's a quick, handy way to get a sequence of numbers really quickly. I sometimes use this like assigning IDs to a piece of data. I want to say this was your experiments or whatever when I have a list I'm working with. That's a nice little shorthand. You can append vectors. So once again, here's a thing where I have functions inside arguments to another function. So we can pick this apart piecewise. So that appended, it took 1 to 3 for the first argument as a vector, and the second vector was 8, 6, 5. And when you append the two together, you get one string for both of them. 1, 2, 3, 8, 6, 5. That's one vector. That's a function that composed the two vectors. So you can compose them using append. And as I pointed out earlier, I might forget exactly what the functions are in append. It has an after, a subscript after which the values are to be applied. So I could do crazy things in there if I wanted. I didn't even know about that. So let's say X, this is the next part. So what if I have a vector assigned to X and it's 1 to 10? So I've assigned the numbers 1 to 10 to the box, the variable X, and I want the value that's in the second position. I get the number 2 back, which is exactly what I put in that position. So using a single bracket, I can access any value that's inside that vector. Now, this is a really important thing to understand here. This part is really kind of fairly unique to R as a computer language, but inside this bracket, I can specify a vector. And I can say, give me the second value, the fourth value, and the sixth value is my index into that vector by using another vector. So I'm using a vector to request values from a vector. And I get 2, 4, and 6, which is what I put in those positions. I mean, if I assign to X something different, -5 to 5, I get different values for those positions. So you can use the values of a vector to ask for certain values out of another vector. This is important when you start fiddling with data sets, which are data frames, which we'll get to in just a moment. It goes even deeper in that I can now assign a value to what I've requested. So this says, in that box X, the 5th and the 10th value are not a number. So now when I look at X, the 5th and the 10th value are not a number. So you can use these this is, one way you can access data. So another thing you can do, another data type. This is important to understand from a statistical perspective. I don't know how much statistics you've had, but if you really want to get in depth in this, there are some R classes that really go deeply into R and how you're going to use it to analyze an experiment. But a factor in statistics is like, it's a class. It's a lot like a string, but it has a very specific meaning. Like if I gave a drug or I didn't give a drug, that could be a factor, drug or no drug, or the dosage of a drug across an experiment, or whether it was control, whether I used control or silencing RNA. So let's pick this apart first. That is a vector of strings. So it's going to say A, C, B, NA, not available, B, A, and B. So the first argument to this function factor is this list of what I'm going to assign to this vector. And then here's the levels that are available for that factor, A, B, and C. And that is the ordering of that factor. So now if I go into X and I assign that to X, I have these as a factor. Notice the quotations are dropped now because this is a factor with 3 levels. So if I had 7 rows in a spreadsheet, and these are the treatments I was giving, A, C, or B, based on what I was doing, and the middle experiment, I don't know what the treatment was. Of course, at that point, what are you going to do with the data? But it's all possible. So what happens then later with R, when you do like linear regression or statistical tests, it knows exactly how to treat a factor. Whereas if it's a string, statistic doesn't know anything about string. It knows how to pick apart a string, do statistical analysis of the occurrence of letters in a string, but as far as actually doing statistics, a lot of times you will load a CSV file, it'll treat some column as a string, you have to convert it to a factor so that the statistical methods know, and so you're being very explicit about how you're treating some piece of data.
So if you didn't define the levels there, would it not be able to extrapolate what the levels are?
It would extrapolate, but what do you think it would do for the ordering?
I guess they would be out of order.
So okay, we can do that. With R, it's pretty easy to test really quick. It still kept them A, B, C, so it did them alphabetical. But if I come up here, so the answer is it did them alphabetical, but what if I wanted them in a different order? And that's how with order they'll appear in graphs and analysis and stuff. Okay. So you can change your order using the levels. But it will extrapolate them, but they'll be in alphabetical order. And that is, once you go to do a plot later and it puts your data in alphabetical order by factor, everybody's like, but I want my control first.
Yeah.
Right? Or I want my, and then all of a sudden, like, okay, well, I got to go back and put the levels in. So I just always include the levels. This is the order I want them in. Thanks. So, yeah. And the beauty of R is you can sit and play with these little things. You just have to understand these basic concepts. So matrix, if you've ever done any matrix calculus, is the same thing as a vector, except now it has 2 dimensions. It has a number of rows and it has a number of columns. So, and they all have to be of the same class once again. So I can create a matrix using this function where I pass in a vector and tell it there's going to be 3 rows, and you do it by row or by column. And now you get rows and columns of data. that are all of the same class. Most likely you will not have a lot of call for use of matrices. However, you could. There are some matrix data out there. You can do it by number of columns. I could say I want 3 columns from 1 to 20, with the numbers 1 to 24 that I passed in as a vector, and it put them in that way instead. But what if that wasn't the way I wanted them put in there? I can start switching out, how I build that matrix. Now I'm putting the values in. I want 3 columns, and I want them coming across this time instead of going down off of the vector. So it's essentially how you're assigning them into that matrix space. So it's like a box that's subdivided with dividers in 2 directions. That's how you're storing all your values. So, and the last example, of course, is the remaining one, which is the same except you're assigning them across that way. So a lot of statistics that are going on in the background in R is a lot of matrix math. So the matrix math in R is actually really quite powerful. It uses some GPU. Yeah, I know not GPU. It uses there's a lot of C optimizations and Fortran calls to libraries going back to the 70s. Normally, you never see that as a user, but it's a really powerful matrix system, and it's a fairly deep rabbit hole. Your normal mathematical operators, if you enclose them in percent signs, become the matrix operators. So now you can do matrix multiplication. Right? And what happens if I just say times? It doesn't work because the sizes don't conform to matrix linear algebra. So you're right, one was the wrong size in one direction or the other. So once again, now there's an important concept here that applies not just to matrices but data frames later. So remember, if you notice on the left there it says 1 comma, 2 comma, 3 comma, 4 comma, where it's showing that's row 1, that's row 2, that's row 3, that's row 1, that's row 2, that's row 3. Column 1, 2, and 3. So if I did this, if I said X, so let's do X. I'm going to cover this a bit more in a moment. If I say give me the value in row 3, column 2, I should expect to see an 11, which is what I get back. So it's just like the vector with single brackets, but now I have a comma, and one denotes the row and the second one denotes the column. And just like before, I can do crazy things like use vectors inside here. Oh, and it actually returned it as a matrix as well. It returned me 3 and 4, 1 and 2, both. That little sub-chunk of the matrix. That's curious. You'll probably not have much call to do that. So, yeah, so these are the examples of, you can also ask for everything on a row. I said give me everything in row 3. Or I could say everything in column 2. And it returns a vector, so you can just grab a whole column or row out of that matrix. So you can slice it a lot of different ways. These also work in assignment, as we were talking about earlier. I can just grab this, and X now has an NA sitting there at 2, 3. So I accessed it and used the assignment operator on it to assign something to that location. So, oops. Now, curiously, it also allows for naming things. I can name these rows and columns. So if I come in here and I say X, redo X a little bit, I can say, give me some row names, and maybe treatments or something I did. Oops. So now they're named. They're not abstracts. So with that, I can actually ask for them by the string of their name. Give me row A. Give me column 2. Give me the value in row A, column 2. So you can do things with strings as well. You can use strings for accessing things. What their name? What?
Can you still reference them by the column number or row number?
Yes. Column, the number's still there. It just additionally has a name now that it can be accessed by. So you can create names. You can use vectors of strings as well to access things. So it's starting to, all the little pieces are bouncing off each other at this point. So this is actually an operation I use quite frequently, but not for matrices, for another data type that we're about to get to. R bind and C bind. Remember we had append for vectors? So I can row bind. I can say I can have two matrices and I want to cram all of them together by row, or I can cram them together by column. I want to shove stuff on this side or on this side. So row bind, let's look at X and Y first. X, Y. So I can R bind X and Y. So just basically shove the two of them together. Now if I tried to do a column bind on this, what do you think will happen? Give me an error. Because this one has 3 rows and that one has 2, and I tried to shove it on this side and those are all empty. So it doesn't like that. It's got to line up or it won't let you do it. So you can there. So basically now you have 3 of each and it works. But if I tried the row bind, it won't work because now it's 2 and 3 the other way. Okay? They don't match. So, well, the matrix probably isn't that useful to you. What is something called a data frame. Most people are familiar with using Excel to store their data. And creating one of those, tables of your data, that's the equivalent of a data frame in R. So since you're working with statistics, this is the heart and soul of it right here. This is my data set. Each column has to have the same data type, but each row across the row, it can have different data types. So each column can be of a different type, but all the data in a single column has to be the same type. So this is one of the most important things to really understand about working with R is the data frame. It's very much like a matrix, except that now I'm no longer restricted by having it all the same type. I can have different things. So here I have a data frame I'm going to construct with the data frame operator. And what you do is you name column X, and column X is going to be equal to, and on this one, see, I'm using, this is an assignment. This is passing it as a parameter into the function. This is the difference between the arrow and the equal sign that I was talking about. The equals, the assignment operator won't work here, but the equals does, because that's the other meaning of equals. So I'm saying in this frame, this is a named parameter, x, and x is going to take these values, and y is going to be the sine of x, and z is going to be the square root of x. So I can construct this data frame now, and I have a nice data frame with named columns. And I can say, give me the vector with this $sign operator of the column x of x. It gives me that vector 1 to 7. So I get the vector back. I can say x $sign y, I get that vector back. So I can get that I can pull a column out really quickly with the dollar sign operator. And there's about 4 other ways to do it as well, of course. So I could also treat it just like I did a vector earlier and say I want the column named Y. And that's what the dollar sign is actually doing, is shorthand for that. So when I constructed a data frame, it created a matrix with a looser constraint on it, and it named the columns. Is essentially what the data frame's doing. So you can access them as shown there by the other means. You can also, as before, you can put vectors in for each piece of it that you're doing. So you get the values 2 and 5 back because you requested the row 2 and 5 for column X. So you get just 2 values back out of that, 2 and 5. Now that may seem a little odd, but once you start working with the data sheet, like if you're in Excel and you're doing macros to refer to other columns and things, that's kind of the equivalent of what you're doing here. So you may be going through a set of data, processing it, and you may have to do kind of crazy little commands because you may want the row that's your control, and I may want to just have all my control values, and I may want to pull out the one that's relative to what I'm currently working on. So even though at this point it seems fairly trivial, the things we've covered, as you see, they start building on each other, and they continue to build until you have this whole toolbox of little pieces. There's 2 very useful commands for dealing with the data frame that I use quite a bit. It's head and subset. So if I said, give me the head of X, it only gave me the first 6. It's 7 long, but it only gave me 6. And by default, head only gives 6. I could ask for just, give me the first 3. Because when you load a CSV file, it could have 10,000 rows. And if I tap the name of that variable, I'm going to get 10,000 rows scrolling by. So a lot of times I just look at the head to even see what the data looks like. Make sure the import from the CSV came in correctly. So subset is a very, very useful command. So with subset, you can now construct a logical operator that it's going to apply to each row. And if that row matches and it says true, you'll get that row back. So it's not a sample, it's a subset. So the example I have here is I'm going to have 1,000 points I'm interested in. And then I'm going to create a data frame. Once again, now inside the data frame, this isn't a variable. This is a name on a column, so I can get away with it without destroying myself. But as I said earlier, if I named a variable t, I could be in trouble. So this constructs from this value to this value. So that executes this piece of code, so -499 so I can piece apart any command and do the individual little pieces throughout here. So t is going to be this range from -499 to 500. And y is going to be the sine of that value, 1 to that value, and the square root of 1 to that value. So now, like I said, if I did D, I get all 1,000 rows. If I do head, I can actually look at it and see the names of the columns. There's a time value, there's a Y and a Z value. By looking just at the head. Now I could say, really what I'm interested in is a subset of this data. So I'm going to pass the data into subset. I'm going to say I want everything where the time is greater than 0, because maybe that's when I gave the drug. And then when Y is greater than 0, so maybe that's some indicator of the validity of the response. And then when Z is greater than 31, because that's when the equipment's accurate. So you create a constraint, you get a subset of the rows where those criteria are satisfied. So that took each row and said, was T greater than 0, and was Y greater than 0, and was Z greater than 31. So you get a subset of rows where those conditions are true. And you notice that it does skip about a bit here, and it's really towards the end of the set when Z is big enough for that to be satisfied. So you can also use let's say Z is a subset where I use or. Any of these conditions can be true. So if I look at the head of Z, I can also look at the length of it. That's another operator I use quite a bit. So there's 750 values it found out of 1,000. Been playing with that. So there's another thing that I find very powerful is also the in operator. And as I said, you can also pick these things apart. Because what's happening here, like if I go back to this subset, I could just take this piece of the function out. And I could say D dollar sign, D dollar sign, D dollar sign. What I get is a vector of true falses. And I could assign that to some reference. Let's do I. So I said D of I row, where that row is true. And I'll get that same set of data. That's what the subset did internally when I break it down into little operations. So the subset function is essentially constructing a vector. So I could come in and play with a vector just to try to figure out why something was becoming true. So I could pick it apart and I could look at all the pieces if I wanted to, or I could just call the function. I think I assigned it to Z earlier. I can also now do subfunctions of Z. Oh wait. Let's assign this to X for now. So I could say X 1 to 10. Oh, can't do that. Give me rows 1 to 10 of X. So it gives me the first 10 rows. So I can treat that as, it's just another data frame, and everything I could do before I could do. So the other one I wanted to show was the subset with the in operator. So this said T is in the set of 4, 7, and 23. So if T matches anything in that vector, it'll accept it. So I got T 4, 7, and 23. So that's a vector. And the in operator applied where T was equal to anything inside that vector. That's a very useful operation. So you can read and write these using the read and write CSV command. That refers to your read table. Really, here's the read CSV command. You basically specify a file, whether or not it has a header, and it'll read that comma-separated file in. So you can go into Excel, and you can export a page as a CSV, and then you can read it right into R using read CSV. Now, one thing about our data sets, the best viewpoint is that a row is a single command. A single data observation. This is kind of hard because a lot of times you'll get an Excel spreadsheet and you'll be spreading your data out and you'll have like an experiment in each tab. R wants one big long list where you have a column that says experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, whatever that experiment for that observation was, what the factor was applied, anything that was about that observation. So each row represents a single observation. Usually you'll have a set of factors on the left-hand columns, and on the right you'll have the observation. Or maybe you observed several things at that point in time, and so you put all those observations that you had. It's a multivariate. I observed a red channel and a green channel, so maybe I have 2 columns for my observations. So you have factors and observations, and every row is structured like that. So it's a little hard sometimes going from a Excel spreadsheet to R because you have to make sure that it's this big long format, that everything is specified that way. And there's another data type as well. It's called a list, where you can have lists and you have a named object, and typing and classing is pretty much out the window. You probably won't use this too much, but I mentioned it for completeness because they sometimes come back from some of the operators. So I can create a list now that has, I stored a vector in the x, a vector of numbers in the x, a vector in the y, and a vector in the z of levels. And lists can actually contain other objects of other objects, and you can get arbitrarily complex at this point. I almost never work with lists. Like I said, I'm mentioning it for completeness. So z was a factor there. And you can access these with the double brackets for a list. It uses double brackets instead of single. That's the operator for list access. I'm not going to cover too much about lists. They're kind of confusing. Now, where this gets interesting, like I said, you can have data structures inside data structures. And R allows for arbitrary objects to have all kinds of content inside them. And where you get into this is I'll call some statistical function and it'll return an object back, and I've got to work on that object. I don't know what's inside that object. Like, let's say, for example, I'm going to do a linear regression of 10 random variables with 10 random variables. So I constructed a data frame of x being 10 random normals and y being 10 random normals, and I wanted to say that y is predicted by x, which I know by creating the data that's not true. But I end up with a model that says, oh, here's your intercept and your regression slope. I can even, if you call summary on it, which a lot of these things return by R, they have a summary method. So the summary of this says that it was not statistically significant, nor an interceptor X, which is good because I didn't put that in. I could have had a type 1 or type 2 error. Actually, I knew they weren't true, so I could have had a type 2 error, I think. So, nevertheless, my statistics are terrible. But what was inside that M object that I got back? I mean, there's two things I can do with it. I can do M and I can do summary M, but there's a lot of information content in there that I may want to use and pull out and do something else with. Well, there's a function in R called str. I don't know what that is, but it tells you everything inside that in terms of what was used. So I can pick that apart now. I can say, oh my goodness, it had, you notice there's dots and dollar signs. I could do M $ coefficients. I got back the coefficients. The first coefficient was that, and the second coefficient was the X. So I could go in now and find those pieces. And you can see they're going down, like this is model and this is Y. For some reason the model object saves its data, so I can say model, I can say Y. So I can keep stringing my access down into that object. But the only way I could get there without guessing was to use that str function to figure out what the heck I had. So I use str quite a bit, just trying to figure out what I've been passed back so I can get to the data that I want. Because who knows, on whatever project I'm working on, it could be some odd factor buried down inside here that I have to get to, and it's actually usually stored, so I have no trouble. There's that example. There's also decision logic. And so I can say if my random normal is greater than 0, which there's a 50-50 chance of that, my value is 1, else it's 2. And this is not happening, huh? Oh yeah, it did. There's a couple 2s. I was about to say the coin's broken, No, so you get random values back. So the result of the computation is now different depending on this random variable. You can also place statements inside these brackets with semicolons. You can actually even space it out over multiple lines. And the only constraint is that this close bracket, else statement, has to be on the same line. That's an oddity of the R syntax. And if you're not aware of that, weird things happen. So I try to generally, like if I'm going to do something like this, instead of a semicolon, maybe I want to do multiple lines. So if I said if R norm 1 is greater than 0, I'm going to open this up. My first line is going to be 23 for the first part of the computation. My second line is going to be 1. The semicolon denoted that it was multiple lines. Now here, if I want an else, I have to have an else. And I have that 24 as a computation. It's going to compute 24 and then throw it away, so it'll never see that. So the only trick is this and this have to be on the same line. Otherwise, you get this. If you're lucky. I have seen circumstances, well, like I said, a lot of times you have a lot of information flying by and you miss things buried down in there. It gets very confusing if it's in a large body of code and you miss that. It has to be on that same line. So another thing is looping, and this is actually a very powerful thing. You can have a for loop that loops over some variable for I in 1 to 3, and this can be any vector you give to your for loop. And now what I'm going to do is, inside this, I'm going to call the print command with I plus 10. And I'm going to close that bracket. When I return, it printed 11, 12, and 13 to the screen. So processing data in a loop is a lot better than writing the same line, copy and paste it 100 times, and then realizing you've got to duplicate the project with a slightly different structure, and copying the whole file and modifying all 100 of those lines, and doing that again and again. Now, some people prefer that method. I, for one, do not advocate it. I think in the long run, your sanity will be preserved by figuring out a loop. Sometimes loops inside loops are what you need. I'm going to loop over this factor, and I'm going to do this operation. So what this did in this loop was it assigned I to the first value of this vector, which was 1. It printed. It assigned I to the next value in this vector, which was 2, and it printed that, what it was given. It assigned I to the next value in that loop, and then it printed that. So, you know, here's an example where you're creating a data frame. You have a simple little data frame, and I'm going to have a summation variable, and for I in d of x, I'm going to create an accumulator that is assigned to itself plus the value of I. And then I get 6 back. Now, if I ran the same for loop again, I'm going to get a different sum because I didn't clear it. Whenever you write accumulators, make sure you clear them. You can also remove variables with the rm command. Sum no longer exists. And the reason is that I got rid of that value. There's already a defined function in the base package called sum. So I had to remove my variable, and now I can call it and I get the base function. So if you step on a variable that's already there, you can remove yours, but you can't remove the base functions that are. They're always sitting there underneath. So can anybody tell me what's going on here? So essentially it's a loop. Oh, I'd reassign. No, we were doing $D signs. It just summed the inverses of those. So it could have also just done this. There's multiple ways to do things in R. So at the heart of any computational language, as I've mentioned several times so far, is this idea of a function. You're calling a function, it's performing a computation, and it's returning your result. And we're composing functions of functions. So it returns the last value that was part of that function. So in R, many arguments to a function have default values, and they also have names. So the random normal, R norm, is a function in R that is a random generator for the normal distribution. And you can see the R norm defaults to a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So if I wanted 5 random normal variables, I can request it and get 5. I can also specify the mean I want to be 10. Or I could say, give me 5 with standard deviation of 10. And then get much more variance in there. Or I can specify both of those, and I can do it in any order I want with those named arguments. So I'm even specifying them backwards, and it figures out the name and applies it to that random normal. So there's a full set of basic math functions that you can use if you do some query math. Oh, there's new ones. I've changed it. So here's all the operators that are available mathematically. Let's see. And as I said, you can pass functions to functions. So I want the sum of 1 to 3, and I want that many random normal variables. So what that did was it computed that sum and said, give me 6 random normals. You can declare your own function. And this says f is going to be a function that takes a named variable x, and it applies this to it. It says, I'm going to take the exponent of negative half x squared divided by the square root of 2 pi. And if you, it's a fairly famous function, so I can say the f of 2 is 0.0539997. I can also integrate that function crazily enough. I can pass that function itself in as an argument. I can say integrate that from negative infinity to infinity, and this is a numerical integration. And since the value is 1, with absolute error less than this, so I can trust that 1 within those bounds. So, as I was showing you earlier, you have some basic statistical functions. You have the probability density, the cumulative distribution, the quantile function, and the random number generator. So if you get into statistics much, these are very, very important functions, for 101 statistics. So I can even do like a histogram now of my random values just by calling the hist function, which goes into one of the plotting routines that I mentioned R could do. And so now I have a plot of 100 random normals, and I did a density plot. And I said I want it on the scale from 0 to 1. So quickly, I could also add some curves. That quick, I'm already doing graphs and plots of my data. So what I did here was I said, give me a histogram of 100 random normals. I want the probability density of the normal, of the statistical normal, and I want the curve of the cumulative probability. So you can see the two relationships of the data there. The classical result. So as an exercise, you can redo that and use the exponential distribution if you'd like. So can anybody guess what the function for giving me a random exponential variable would be?
REXP?
Yeah. So I just guess REXP. There we go. I can do exponential plots as an exercise now. I can even do a t-test. Is this data sufficiently different from 0? The mean of the data is sufficiently different from 0. For 100 random normals, the p-value is 0.23, so it's not significantly different than 0. I know it wasn't. I simulated data that I knew my mean was 0, and my one sample t-test is coming back using a t-test and saying, yeah, you're right. And, statistically, there's no evidence that this is different than 0. I can do a paired t-test with the same t-test function. And Once again, the p-value is really bad, at 0.99. It's like there is no way. There's a complete lack of evidence that these are different random variables, and of course they were put in. So if you take the biostats class, these random simulators are a lot of times used to test your experimental design. And you can see exactly what the power of your experiment would be if you know a little bit about the variance. So here, let's say that the mean is 1. I get a highly significant p-value difference. There truly were two different random samples. One had a mean of 0 and one had a mean of 1. So one of the other big things in here, this gets into more of like what a data set. So I'm going to assign a variable to 3, saying I want 3 repetitions of 2 conditions. And so I'm going to fake some data here with the fancy data frame statement, where I'm using the repeat function to repeat 0 to 10, the number of repetitions times the length of my conditions. And my repetitions will be 1 repetitions each of 11. So this is actually a really wonderful statement to pick apart and just see what it did. Because if I look at my data, I got a whole bunch of data simulated really quickly there with one little function. So, like, look at the time. It said repeat 0 to 10 times my number of repetitions times the length of conditions. So if I said repeat 0 to 10 6 times, I get 0 to 10, 0 to 10, 0 to 10, 0 to 10, 6 times. Likewise, if I had said, that was times it. Yeah. If I actually used the each operator, you can see that it would do it a little differently. 6, 6, 6, 1, 6, or 6 zeros, 6 1s, 6 2s as it walks through the data set. So now I'm going to do a little simulation of the result of an experiment with some error in it using the random normal function. So now I have a data frame, and here I created a column that didn't exist before, y, which is the result of some observation in an experiment. I created a linear model of the time in the experiment times 2, plus some random result of the condition it was in, and an interaction. So I've created like actually a fairly complex simulation here with interactions and all kinds of statistical factors going around. So then if we do a summary of the linear regression model of it, you can see that the intercept was significant and the time variable was highly significant. So, and this R-squared value is 0.96, so that was a really good model for describing this data set that I made up. Well, I know that's true because I put that in, except it was 2 and my estimate's 2.3. But the problem is I didn't take into account any of the other factors in this data frame. So I have, oops, I should use my head function so I can see what I have. So I have, what this is saying, with a simple linear regression model, is that I have data observed over time. There was a repeat of the experiment. There was a condition I put it in, and there was an observation. So as you notice, each row is a single observation, as I was talking about how to construct one of these CSVs. And the time, the repetition or experiment number, and then the condition for that observation is all specified. So these are the factors, and this is the output. So one of the factors is a real variate, which we're using as saying that the output is predicted by time, which, in my simulation, I put that in. So I can get a little more complex, and I could say, we're getting shorter and shorter on time, but I could say, why don't I have a little more complex model, statistically, of the way to look at this data, and I could add in time or condition as a factor. So now I have an intercept, which was very significant, a time, which was very significant, and condition B. Notice it didn't mention condition A, because it's treating that as the default. So condition B, if condition B existed, it added this to it. And actually, yeah, it subtracted 1 if it was condition B. So actually, it's adding 1 here for some reason for condition B, but there's probably something in the math that explains why that's occurring. But if I multiply those two, now I get the factors in that formula. So this is a formula which is actually yet another data class. So I'm saying y is predicted by the time and the condition and an interaction between time and condition. So if you haven't had a stats class, I apologize, but this is something they get into with linear regression. But now I've picked apart these 3 factors. So I have time is 2, which if we look at the original simulation, what I put in was 2. So my estimate got really close now that I have the model specified with all the pieces I put in. Condition B is negative 2, which was actually negative 1. So I don't know why that. So that random data, I don't have that huge of a data set, I would assume, is part of the problem. So condition B times data times time is 1/2. So the interaction should be about half. So it is about a half. So this is actually, now you can see the p-values are all highly significant. And essentially at this point there is a very good concordance between my simulation and what the statistical estimation of the model are. It is, using simple linear regression. The reason I threw this out there is linear regression is something that's commonly done quite often. But one of the important things here is that you specify a formula. That little tilde and these variables are referring to columns in that data frame. And that tilde says y is predicted by when it occurred in time and a condition. If you have something that's, right now I'm using linear regression, which is a linear model. If you have something that's nonlinear and you want to get really complex with logs and square roots and all kinds of other things, and it's not a linear model, there's an NLS function that is used quite commonly. And that's a fairly powerful function. However, it's a bit cantankerous because any nonlinear fit is very dependent on where you estimate your parameters to be. So you have to give it a very good starting guess, or NLS will not fit a formula. A generalized linear model is actually more useful in a broader sense if you have binary data. There was cancer, there wasn't cancer, because you can do things like binomial data. We're getting off into the statistics that R offers now. But I wanted to cover just the really basic rudiment functions that are available. So it also does analysis of variance, which is really a powerful tool if you've done ANOVA or using Tukey's method of honestly significant differences in the ANOVA model. So just once again, I'm including this just to show you some of the statistical power. So there's on our data, we can also look at the ANOVA comparison of the factors. And we can see that the conditions in that experiment were significant. They did have an effect. And that there was an interaction between time and condition. And time was also a significant value. Now, this doesn't give you estimations. It's just saying these are significant differences occurred based on any of those factors in my original design. So you can even now do some estimates of what those differences are between those pieces. And, time was not a factor, it was a variable. Tukey doesn't like that. So you have to get rid of it. So yeah, it dropped them. So B minus A, condition of B minus condition of B, it estimates to be 1, which if you remember, that was the original simulation. It was off by 1. So it actually found it using the value of that difference in those two factors, while accounting for all the other things that are going on. So the simulation is now matched with, actually, I think, unfortunately, I'm going to try to open this. Last time I tried to open this website, which was an absolutely beautiful website, it was no longer on the web.
Valerie.
So I'm holding out hope here. However, without that, this actually makes the next part a little bit odd. Because this used to have a whole gallery of plots that were done using R and it had the code as a little snippet. And this thing will be resurrected at some point, but yeah, I think it's a dead one. Because there's nothing coming back, so it's still dead, unfortunately. So plotting this data, so as I showed you, there was a quick little plot I did with a histogram earlier. I can do a simple plot with the plot command, and before I call the plot command, if I call the command PNG, PostScript, PDF, BMP, or TIFF, if I call that before I call plot, it writes it to a file instead of to the screen. And then I have to call dev.off to finish writing the file. So anything you can print on the screen, you can print to a file as well in any of the formats you choose. I personally have found PostScript and PDF to work quite well. Occasionally I'll use PNG or something if I have a specific thing, but PostScript is a really good format because now you can open it in Illustrator and you can edit it using Illustrator and you can tweak some of the fonts and choices without having to go through tweaking it in R, which is a little bit more difficult. Then it's not repeatable, so there's a trade-off. So here's a scatter plot of two random variables, 500 points, just randomly scattered around 0. With the plot command, it really doesn't have much. It has an X, a Y, the type of the plot, a title, a label, and that's it. And so you're like, okay, well, where's all this richness that you referred to? It's actually in this command called par. And that controls the graphical environment. And there is just an overwhelming number of parameters that you can find to set to change a plot. Margins, fonts, labels. The sky's the limit there. You can do multiple plots. So like here, I can use and anything in par I can just pass into plot and it passes it on to par, which makes it a little more confusing. If you're going to do much with graphics, you need to go look for some of the websites on how to use graphics in R. So, what did it do? Oh, it made the font huge here on the side and on the bottom. It made it so big that it doesn't fit anymore. So I said, this actually sets the font size if I go back of the label, if I go back to the par. Sex lab, the magnification can be used for X and Y labels relative to the current setting of CEX. So that command, so you can start changing things. So now here's an example with a little bit more. So I added some points. And in this case, I just added a red triangle that was really huge as a point on the graph. And I can say, give me a line through this. This is a slope and an intercept. There's a lines command. I can drop some lines on a plot. I can add some text somewhere. So you can go through, and based on your data and things you're getting back from fitting statistical models, you can plot a linear regression. In fact, at this point, I've given you all the tools you would need to go back and take the linear regression example and actually plot that data and put a line on it and show the regression line. You have to get the regression model back. You have to use the SDR command to find the coefficients, pull the coefficients out, pass them to a line routine, the AB line, to put the line on top of the plot of the data from the data frame. So all the commands are there to do that in this presentation. In fact, that was left as a homework assignment, I think. I had a suggested workflow here on using CSV and read CSV. I think that was the end of it. So I don't know Lourdes' policy on homework, but a really good homework assignment or a learning assignment to assimilate, because really in the end the homework is not about making it hard on the students. It's about giving you an exercise to test whether you learned this. So if you take that and go into this presentation and you pull out that piece where it created a data frame that had a simulated experiment, create that data, put it in a file, and then you run a linear regression on it, take that model, plot it, put a regression line on it, and then go back and print that to a file, you'll know you've learned R at that point. You'll know you have the basic tools down. That is a really wonderful exercise. Every command you need is within this presentation. Maybe not all the variables that you can call, or not variables, the arguments that you can pass into a function or specify, but you can get that with the question mark. So that's a really wonderful exercise to make sure you learned it. So that's, any questions? We don't have much time left. Discussion? You're all chomping at the bit to get to doing a plot of linear regression.